Alright, so in the last video we added the player input component, we set up the input actions, and now we are in our rigid body character controller script, and we need to change how we were getting input, which was using the input manager and the various static methods inside of the input class. We need to begin using the new input system class and getting the data that way. So the way that we used the old input system, we were reading the value of the input every frame inside of update. And interestingly, the new input system uses a much more event-based approach. So it ties into our previous investigation of the observer pattern. So rather than updating what, input, if I hit F12, we'll go to the definition, it's a vector 2. And so every frame we're storing an X and a Y from the player's input in this input variable. So instead of doing that every frame, I'm going to make essentially an event handler. And so we'll say private void, and I'm going to name it after the event, which is named after the action. So the action is move. So I'm going to name this thing on move. Because this is, there evidently is a built-in Unity message that is similar enough that I got messed up with autocomplete there. But anyway, this is the name of the action we want to react to with our event handler that we're about to write. And so what do we want to have happen every time the player moves? Is we need to update the inputs X and Y. And so again, if you remember, move happens to be of the type vector 2. So move is going to provide, mood will provide a vector 2 to our event handler. And so what I guess I can do, let's see, we'll say input dot X is going to equal something, and we need to get it from the move event. So we need some sort of parameter to support here so that when move is happening, it's telling us a little bit more about the move. And the way this works is kind of weird. And there is a special type of parameter that the new input system is going to give us called a callback context. So to find that, we need to type in input action, which is going to need a using statement. So I'm going to hit control period and add using Unity engine.input system. And inside of input action class is something called a callback context, which is a struct that's going to contain the data from the input event. And I'm just going to call this context. And here's the part that's maybe not so straightforward. So you might instinctively think, well, I should make this something of the type vector 2 because move is going to give us a vector 2 because that's what we plugged in here, right? But instead, all of the input actions are going to give us something of this type callback context, and then you have to read the context with a special variable or a special function called read value. So actually, because we're getting an entire vector 2, we don't need to do the input X and Y separately, so we can do this all in one line where we say input equals context dot read value, and then kind of like we would use get component, we put in angle brackets, and here is where you tell Unity what type we expect that context to be. So and we figure that out again by looking at our action set here, and we see, okay, move is going to be set up to return us a vector 2 whenever that happens. So we can now get rid of the entire update function here, which was being used to update input.x and input.y. Now we are just reading a new vector 2 that gets passed to us whenever the player moves. And so we can delete update. I'm going to delete the extra white space. And it's kind of set up how we want it on this end. That's all the code we need. But the trick is, if you remember, just because we wrote an event handler, the next thing is we have to subscribe and unsubscribe to the event. There's a couple ways you can do this with the new input system. So if you go to the player input parameter that we added to our player game object here, you'll see that there is this drop down property that says behavior. And so there's some choices. There's send message, which is like going to try to call a function named after the event or the event handler method in your class that this is on, and broadcast messages. And then there's these two about events. And so one of them actually gives you the ability to invoke C# events, where you could actually manually in your code subscribe and unsubscribe. The trick to that is to, if you open your input actions, there's actually a way to make this generate a C# class. Oh, there it is. So you select it here, you don't have to open it, and then the inspector, there's an option to generate a C# class, and that will give you a class that has all of the events that you would need to subscribe to so that you could observe them. But rather than go that route, I'm going to try, let's look at Unity events in this example. So back on our player component, our player input component, let's change the behavior drop down to invoke Unity events. And basically this is just going to give us a way to subscribe to the events using Unity's graphical interface in the Unity editor as opposed to in code. So if I expose events here, we don't care about the UI events, we care about the player event, and specifically we want to know when move is happening. And here's where you see it's going to give you a parameter callback context. If that said vector2, we would need to make sure our event handler supported vector2, but they all are taking callback context here. And these, the reason it's divided into player and UI, again, is based on the maps that we set here. All right. There's an issue. If we go to player and we find the event that we care about and we want to add something here, so I'm going to hit the plus button, and this is where we could sort of subscribe to this event. And so the class that has the method that I want to subscribe to the move event is in my rigid body character controller. That's where I created that onMove function, and so I'm going to drag that in there. And then now you would select this drop down and choose the function on that class that you want to subscribe. But I'm not seeing it in the list, and this is just a part of how Unity events work. If you want to add or subscribe one of your custom functions to a Unity event, you actually have to make it public. So we could leave this private if we used C# events, but since we're going to practice using Unity events here, I have to make this public. And basically that's going to expose it to the Unity editor. And so now if I go back to Unity and I find that drop down, this time if I click and I find rigid body character controller, you can see there's one up in this category that says dynamic callback context. That means when it says dynamic like that, it means that it's going to properly read in the parameter that the move event is trying to pass. So that is the one I want to choose here. And so now every time the move event happens, it will automatically call our onMove function inside of our rigid body character controller script, which I think should be good enough to get us to be able to move once more. So we still shouldn't be able to look, but I think I could move. Yeah, so my camera is not gonna change because I haven't fixed that yet, but I can move again. All right, so what I need to do now is save my scene and save my project, and let's open GitHub Desktop and let's make a commit, and we can say we what can we say? We refactored move to use the new input system. I guess this is move input handling. There we go. All right, so let's commit that and push. And then in the next video, we will tackle restoring mouse look to our Cinemachine free look component.